These people have asked me to say that I'm Jerry Schatzberg, and I am Jerry Schatzberg.
Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. In today's episode, we sit down with Jerry Schatzberg, the legendary photographer and filmmaker whose lens defined the look and attitude of the 1960s. From early shoots of Bob Dylan, Edie Sedgwick, and the Rolling Stones, to iconic fashion spreads and intimate celebrity portraits, Schatzberg captured a generation in motion. Later, he brought his gritty verite sensibility to movies such as The Panic in Needle Park, working with the then unknown Al Pacino. This rare conversation offers an intimate glimpse into a restless and visionary mind, still reflecting, still creating, well into his 90s.
And I did read a small ad in I think it was the New York Times, of somebody that was looking for a photographic assistant. And I didn't know what that was, so I called the number and I started asking questions. But he sent me to see Lillian Bassman, and she was very nice, and she saw that I probably wasn't right for the job, but she interviewed me and said, well, I can hire you, but we don't really have very much money to pay you. I said, well, what do you have? He says, and she said, $25. I said, well, that doesn't sound bad. And I thought she meant $25 a day. She meant $25 a week. I had an uncle that worked for a company that rented diapers to people. So I don't know whether they rented them by the week, by the month, or something, but they rented that, and for that they would get a free photograph of their baby. If the people rented the diapers, they would give them a free photograph of their child. But I borrowed some money from my mother, and I bought a Rolleiflex, and I started going in the street, and I just photographing in the street. Some of the stuff I liked, some of the stuff I didn't like, but I was expressing myself. I'd see something that interested me, I'd take a picture of it. That was my beginning with photography. So they started giving me appointments, and you'd get about 8 or 10 appointments a day. But you'd come to the first sitting, and they say, well, no, you can't come in, the baby's sick. Well, no, you can't come in, the baby's sleeping. Or you can't come in, I'd end up doing 2 sittings a day. So that didn't really work out financially for me. I went back to the original guy that I went to see about being a photographic assistant. So he sent me out, and he sent me to Bill Helburn. And I think he hired me because I asked for so little money, while other people were probably asking $60, $70, whatever. So he hired me, and he had a darkroom assistant who became a very close friend of mine, but he knew all about the cameras and everything, and so that was the way I learned, watching Jack, and Jack would tell me. And he introduced me to the model agencies. And so I started taking pictures, and because I had been taking pictures of babies and things like that, they saw something there. So I started doing models. So he got me started taking pictures of aspiring models. But it's from that different agencies or people would see my photographs, and they'd say, well, who took this? And if they didn't think it was too expensive or anything, I'd get a job every once in a while. And I was getting a fairly good reputation. And at one point, Vogue called and said, Mr. Liberman would like to talk to you. When they said he was the art director of Condé Nast, then I looked it up, and I saw he was pretty important, Well, he said he's going to give me assignments here and there. So he gave me these little assignments at the beginning of the magazine or the end of the magazine of Vogue. And his purpose was to see whether I could handle it. He was very elegant. He always dressed wonderful in suits. He was really a fine gentleman as compared to Brodovich, who was a peasant. And Liberman was art director of all of Condé Nast, while Brodovich was basically the art director of Harper's Bazaar. And he had his people from his course. He was teaching this course now. I think I got into the second or third version of his course. What he would do, he would give you an assignment, and at the end of the assignment, he'd always say, okay, now you go out and next week amaze me. You come in the next day and everybody would put their photographs face down on a table, and he would pick them up one at a time and criticize them. And I remember once I did something that I thought it was brilliant, and it was really so mechanical and so far away from good fashion. But I thought it was fantastic, and he ripped it to pieces, and by the time he was finished, I was ready to say, okay, stop it, But I learned that it was wrong what I was doing. And from the comments on all these other people, because we were all amateurs, and he was giving you professional opinions about these photographs. And I learned a lot in his course, and because the people, I think there were about maybe 15 or 20 students in each class. I had designed my own lights. Bill had a bank of lights. We had pipes that were all connected to one another, and then he would hang a lamp on the pipes and cover the front with fiberglass to take it out of being too sharp. You didn't want to see the shadows from the lights and all that. I had talked to some people that worked at a place where they manufactured fluorescent lights. But I felt fluorescent lights would automatically give me a filtered light that wasn't that sharp. I built four banks, 4x8. I'd use two of them in one. I'd use the lighting in different ways, but one way I'd use it, I'd shoot into the lights, and I'd put two banks together, and it would just overcome whatever else you see. You just see white, pure white. And that was and then the other two banks I'd put wherever I wanted to put them to get my light. Then I did a series for Christian Dior. It was Christian Dior. He said he had seen their collection. He thought that I might, and this was my first big assignment from him. But then he said, I think I'm going to send you to Paris to do the collections. And I said, oh boy. And he did. He sent me to Paris to do the collections. So they built my lights in Paris at the Vogue studio. I went there. We did a little experimenting and and all that. And then he liked what he saw in the first sitting that I did here of Christian Dior, and then he liked the Vogue sitting that I did there. So I was on my way to becoming a Vogue photographer now, and I knew the photographers. I knew Parkinson. I knew there were a couple of Vogue photographers that were working all the time, and I photographed them while they were photographing the collections for Vogue. That picture up there with the hat.
Yes.
Well, that's behind the scenes, because I often wondered, because there was Parkinson's shoot, but I don't know what he shot. I saw her bend down like that. I saw the hat covering her outfit. And that to me was behind the scenes. And Esquire loved them, and they published a whole series of those. You couldn't beat Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, and they worked, and through Brodovich, because Avedon and Penn were some of his first students. I was probably in the third or fourth classes. I would say Harper's Bazaar and Vogue were the leaders. Liberman was art director of Condé Nast. So after he told me I couldn't work for Vogue anymore, eventually I worked my way around to working for Glamour, and he let me work for Glamour, and Glamour was one of his magazines. But he didn't say anything about that. And when I'd see him, we'd be, hi, how are you, and all that, but he knew I was working for Glamour. I didn't like working for Glamour. Glamour was too childish for me. It wasn't really the elegance of Vogue and the elegance of Harper's Bazaar. But, you know, you work where you can. I just told my friends, the other photographers, I'm going to work here and I'm doing behind the scenes. I'm not going to be doing what you're doing. But I started out doing little things. I remember I did one photograph. That's when the taxis decided they were changing over from big taxis to little taxis. Because usually when you hailed a cab, if you were a couple, he would open the door, let you get in, and then he would get in after. But they were big taxis, so you could manipulate. With the new taxis, you couldn't. So I changed it around. You hailed a cab, she would open the door for the man to get in, because it was more difficult for him to swish across the taxi. So it's little things like that, and that was at the beginning of the magazine, you know, where they give you hints on things. In the meantime, on my own, I was photographing models who had access to clothes. Like I photographed Peggy Moffat a lot, and Peggy was from California, but she was the house model for Rudy Gernrich. And every time she'd come into town, she'd come in with one or two of his outfits, and I'd always, you know, photograph them. One I remember, because I did 85% of my shooting in the park, because from here or from where my old studio was, it was easy to get up into the park and you get permission, and there's always wonderful spots. I remember she had this black dress, black hat with a veil. I mean, it was a great looking outfit, because I loved Rudy's clothes. And she came in, she got dressed, and we walked into the park, and I said, okay, now what do we do? And I called my assistant over, I said, buddy, get me a chicken. He said, for how many people? I said, no, not to eat, just get me a chicken, a live chicken. And he said, okay. And a half hour later, he came back with a chicken. And so I tied a piece of string onto the chicken, and there's my high fashion model walking a chicken in the park. Well, I had photographed the Beatles when they first came here at Carnegie Hall. So that was my entree onto photographing English people. But Bailey, when he saw my pictures, he told me he liked my pictures, but just, you got to photograph the Rolling Stones. That's the group, you know. And he was very friendly with Mick Jagger and all that. And then this guy comes in wearing a sweater and big messy hair. And they sat down, and I went over to talk to him. I found out this was Mick Jagger, who Bailey was talking about all the time. We talked for about a half hour, and I said, are you playing anywhere? Is there any place I can see you playing? He said, yeah, we're playing this afternoon. I said, can we go? He went and got a telephone, called up, and put aside about 20 tickets for us. We got wonderful pictures of the crowds outside looking through fences and all that. Mick was in the first car with Chrissy Shrimpton, Gene Shrimpton's sister. That's who he was dating at the time. And we pulled in. We couldn't get in very far because there were crowds of people. You know, they couldn't get in, so they were outside. And they just to get a look at Mick was just heaven for them. So we pulled in. There were about 8 cars. And Mick was in the first car. He figured he's got to get in, so he just opened the door, started running, and they started pulling on his sweater. They were tearing his sweater off him, you know. And finally he got in. There were 2 or 3 groups that went on before the Stones, and I figured the Stones are backstage putting on their uniforms, because the groups that came out were all wearing the same costumes and all that, and I figured they were backstage putting on their costumes. And then they introduced the Rolling Stones, and they came out in their street clothes. Mick had his torn sweaters and all that, and they came out and they performed, but the people went nuts over them, because they were individual. They were not taking any crap from anybody. This is what they do. They sing. When I knew the Stones were coming over, because by now I was friendly with the Stones, and I knew they were coming over. I wanted to do something special for them. So I figured we'll have a party at my studio. I asked Jane if she would want to be one of the hosts, and Nikki Haslam. Do you know Nikki Haslam?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Nikki, so the three of us actually did the party for the Stones, and the people were coming in all day long, and Mick would come in, make a connection with some girl, he'd leave, he'd come back, you know. I was shooting a musician in my studio, and this guy was there. He was either a friend of Dylan's or he had some connection with Dylan. And while I was shooting, and I knew that he had the connection, I said, "Hey, you know, I'd love to shoot Dylan. If you could do anything about that, I would love it." He said, "Oh, sure." And the next day he called me and he had made the arrangements. He was recording somewhere, I think on 8th Avenue. And I made an arrangement for myself to come there and take pictures while he was recording. But at the same time, I got a call from a Sarah, I forget what her name was, but
This was his girlfriend?
his wife.
His
well,
wife.
well, I didn't know that, you know, because when I was shooting her, I did about 4 or 5 sittings of her. Every time we'd be together, she'd always be talking about Dylan. Always, "Oh yeah, he's playing here, he's doing that, and Dylan this and Dylan that." And I said, yeah. We kept on going with Dylan. So I get a call from Sarah, which I hadn't talked to in about 3 or 4 years. I said, "Sarah, how are you? What are you doing?" And all that. And then she said, I hear you want to photograph Bobby." And it sounded a little bit strange. I didn't know that she was on a first name situation with Bobby, you know. And she said, and she kept saying, "Bobby this and Bobby that." I said, "How do you know so much about him?" She said, "I'm married to him." So the same girl that I was photographing years ago, who loved Bobby, married Bobby and divorced Bobby, unfortunately. So then I went to the studio. And as soon as I walked in, he was expecting me. He knew I was coming, and he immediately started to play what they'd been recording all morning. He said, "Oh, you got to hear this, you got to hear that," you know, because he liked what he was recording, and it was, you know, great stuff. I mean, at the beginning of his career, he was a regular guy. Yeah, no, there may have been times that he was wanted his piece, or he could get pretty. Snarky, you know, depending on what it was. But we had a great relationship. I mean, I did him first at the recording studio. And I figured if I got good pictures here, then I could ask him to come to my studio. And they loved the pictures that I did in the studio, so I was home free, you know. And then I said, now I have other ideas that I'd like to do in my studio. Would you come to my studio? He called and said he's got a new album coming out and he wanted me to do the cover. I started to photograph him in the studio. I had put down some ideas, some plans and all that, and I didn't really like what I was getting. So I asked him if he would go out with me in the street, you know, and he said, yeah. It was quite cold out and I didn't want to take him out into the cold and put on a big heavy coat or something. I didn't think it would be right, so I just found something that was equivalent to his little suede jacket. I just had a little something, and we went out, and we got into a car, we started driving, and I remembered when I was a kid, I used to go to the Fulton, the meat market down, I think, on the east side, and they used to slaughter cattle there and then ship it out and all that. And finally, when I got there, there was a building I liked, and I thought I'd like to use that as the background. Out of that came Blonde on Blonde. I went out without a tripod, and I just had the camera around my neck, and it was very cold, and I was probably moving the camera. They weren't all that way, but when Dylan saw them, he saw the one that was blurred, like that's the one. He pointed right to, that's the one. And he picked it right then. By me taking him out of the studio, I gave him something more to do. He was cold, and he had to overcome that. And sometimes he was able to, and sometimes he wasn't able to. And you could see that he was cold, and I was cold. And but I was facing the same problems that he was facing. Did you see the film on that's out now of?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, that depiction of.
Actually, I would like any thoughts you have about seeing that movie.
Well, I didn't really care for it because maybe I knew him too well, and he tried to do things, even putting his hand to his face, or the way Dylan did it, and I just thought that was bad choices, and I didn't really care for it too much. When Albert Grossman saw them, he liked the photographs, and he asked me if I would photograph Edie Sedgwick. And I knew for Edie, and we were friends. We'd eat at the same restaurant, we'd see each other all the time. And I said, sure, I'd love to photograph her. But I was walking up Park Avenue South, and there was Andy walking down Park Avenue South with a photographer, a female photographer. Hi, Andy, how are you? Hi, Jerry. We talked for a bit, and he says, what are you up to? I said, actually, I'm going to photograph Edie. And he looked at me, but Edie was his Edie. And you're photographing Edie? Oh, yeah, And I knew I had said the wrong thing. I just wanted to get out of there, so I just said, well, I'm on my way, I've got to go over. I said, I'll see you. He left, so I got back to the studio, and Andy calls. When are you photographing Edie? He said, would it be all right if I came along and photographed you photographing Edie? He just didn't want to, he wanted it to be his sitting, or whatever. And I knew that. I said, yeah, I don't mind. He came along, and he was with Gerard, and I knew Gerard, and Gerard was cool, I had no problem with him. So he said, I just want to photograph you photographing Edie. I said, okay. And then the photographer, I think she said, is it all right if I have my camera and I'm photographing him, photographing you? And all that? I said, yeah, you can all come, And I didn't know, but she then called a whole bunch of people, and 40 people showed up in my studio. And I said, no, I can't do this. So I said, okay, you people just stay here. And then I took Andy, Gerard, and this girl, and a model, Edie, into my dressing room. And I set it up, and I was photographing her in the dressing room. She was photographing Andy. And then I hear in the background, Gerard say, but Andy, there's no film in the camera. He says, it doesn't matter. It was typical Andy. And he just wanted to be part of it and say he was part of it or whatever it was. And he felt that Edie was his property, as he felt that Jane was his property, as he had about 4 or 5 other people that were his property, But I was in a business where photographers became filmmakers, and filmmakers were out there making films, and that had never done photographs and all that. It was all,
It was a much more fluid time.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Well, then models started getting exorbitant amounts of money to just do When I was working, the highest paid model was Jean Patchett, and she was getting $60 an hour. They were getting $6,000 a sitting now, and $10,000 a sitting. So it was a whole different world. I knew John and Joan, Dunn and Didion, but I didn't know them. They weren't close friends, but I knew them. I'd met them, And they sent me this script, and I had already made up my mind that I didn't like working with the film people. So I politely turned the script down, and I went up to my business manager's office one day, and he had some stuff to show me, and he said, "There's a script that I think you should read." And he brought it out, and it was the script that they had sent me. I said, "You know, Marty, I think I've turned that down." He said, "Why? I think it's a pretty good script." I said, "Yeah, but I just don't like working with these film people. They don't have respect for the things that I have respect for. You know, they didn't care about film. They scratched my negatives. Before I left, he said, "You know, Al is interested in that script." And I had seen Al 5 or 6 years before that in Indian Wants the Bronx, Israel Horowitz's film.
Really first big breakthrough.
Yeah, and I saw him on, I don't know if it was off Broadway or it was on Broadway, but I thought this guy was fantastic. And I said to myself, boy, if ever I made a film, that's the guy I'd like to work with. I called the Dunn Didion group the next day, and I told them that, you know, I was stupid, I read it too fast, I should have taken my time and all that. And they said, well, why don't we start over again? About 2 weeks later, they said the studio just called them. This is done in Didion. And they think, they don't want Pacino, they think he's too old. I said, too old? What do you mean too old? I said, what do they do? Look at his birth certificate? His birth certificate, he's 31, but he's like 12 years old. You know, I said, what are you talking about? And I was quite annoyed with that and the reaction, and so I started talking to Nick Dunn, who was John's brother, and I told him what had happened, and he was going to be the producer of this film. And he said, well, why don't we just get together all the young actors that they're talking about and read them and see. If we read somebody that's great, wonderful. If we don't, we say, no, it's got to be Pacino. So we went through many actors, and we didn't like any of them. And I said, the last one to come and see me was De Niro. And he was a good actor. And I thought about it. I thought about it a lot. I didn't see too much of an age group or an age difference between them. But I did think that Al was more working class and would fit into a drug film better than De Niro, who I felt was a little more middle class, you know. And so I decided that I wanted Al. I told them, and we went through all these people, and we didn't find anybody. So Nick said, okay, well, I'll just tell him that it's got to be Al. I think last year was the best year I ever had in selling photographs. So something must be happening. People are calling that I've never talked to, I never tried to solicit. So the word is getting around, or the photographs, or the whatever is getting around, and we don't complain about that. We just say, yeah, send the money. Well, the retrospective has come at a time when I'm already an entity. You know, if it happened 15 years earlier, you know, I'd be asking somebody to buy me a cup of coffee. But you know, it's always wonderful when people know who you are and admit it, and are interested in doing what you're doing.
Artifacts is a free oral histories platform. Please like, subscribe, and visit our website, www.artifacts.movie, for an ad-free, interactive experience with bonus content. If you're able, please make a tax-deductible donation at www.artifacts.movie/donate. Hit the link on screen to watch another Artifacts interview.